Welcome to EU Untangled, the podcast that untangles EU policy and politics. I'm Victor Aguilar, your host.
And I am Alex Roth.
We have a great episode ahead of us.
Yeah, we talked a great deal about EU topics in the past, from AI regulation to EU elections and even geographical indications.
But today's episode goes back to basics. What does it mean and what does it take to be part of the EU?
Just a little disclaimer, if you're tuning in hoping to hear the latest hot goss on EU accession negotiations, you're not in the right place here. For instance, we won't be able to tell you if and when Ukraine will join the EU.
Yeah, if you're here for those reasons, get out of here.
But what we want to do in this episode is we want to provide some basic facts and untangle indeed what EU membership means for the member states, for the candidate countries, and of course for the EU itself.
Let's roll, baby. We want to remind you that EU Untangled is an independent podcast by me, Victor Aguilar, and Alexander Roth. It means all opinions that we express in the podcast are solely ours and cannot be attributed to any third party. Alex, I guess a good starting point for this episode is to understand what the European Union is. How would you define what the EU is today?
Vic, you start with the easy questions on the start of the episode.
You know me too well.
The European Union, so the EU is, you can call it a group of countries that have agreed on a set of rules, for instance, in which they do certain things. They agreed on having a common room where trade is easy without any tariffs. They even have agreed on certain political institutions, for instance, the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the European Council, to create laws. And these will be then applied in the entire European Union. There's even an institution that takes care of foreign policy. It's more than just a group. It also has its own, you can call it political identity. It's its own body, the EU, but it's also a group of countries at the same time.
So I guess it's fair to say that the European Union is some kind of club. I don't think it's far-fetched to think of it as quite an exclusive club. There is only 27 members, and these 27 members, most of them, are among the most developed and the richest countries on Earth today. So part of what we're going to be discussing today is how you get to be part of that club, what it takes, and what it means. But before we get into these details, I think it'd be important to wind back the clock and understand how the European Union went from being an idea to being a union of 27 countries. Can you walk us through it?
Yeah, I think that's a good starting point, and we probably have to rewind our clock around 80 years. So we are now in the year 2025 and we go back to the year 1945. And what happened in the year 1945 in Europe, I guess most of our listeners will know, this is the end of the Second World War, which is probably the gravest and the most horrible war ever fought in human's history. And as a reaction to that, many things happened, and we of course cannot go into details here. One thing that politicians understood after the Second World War is that we need finally peace in Europe. And one attempt was then 5 years later, the foundation of what is called the European Coal and Steel Community. So in 1950, 6 European countries, namely France, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, West Germany, and Italy, they drafted the Treaty of Paris. And this Treaty of Paris then founded the European Coal and Steel Community, the ECSC. And this community is basically the first block of what later then becomes the European communities, and this becomes the European Union. And the idea was to basically control steel and coal of other countries so that it would be harder to create weapons, and because coal and steel are fundamental for war. And of course to create also a common market for coal and steel. So this was the first founding stone or founding block. And 5 years later, in the very famous Treaty of Rome, so in 1957, the European Economic Community was founded. And so the Treaty of Rome and the European Economic Community created the four freedoms that are fundamental to the European Union still today.
And what are those four freedoms?
The idea behind the four freedoms are the free movement within the EU, or back then the European Economic Community, of goods, of people, services, and capital. That's the basic idea. Whether this is already achieved by now, we can discuss, but this is the founding idea. Yeah, we start here because I think we cannot really answer the question of how you can enter a club without knowing why do you create the club and who created first and foremost the club. And I think it's just maybe important also to know that the club was created by 6 countries that were actually in war a few years earlier, namely Germany and Italy on the so-called side of the Axis, and of course France and the Benelux countries on the Allied side. But they decided then it was time to unify to a certain extent, at least in the 50s, by creating the coal and steel community, the economic community, and also I have to mention the last part of this block is the European Atomic Energy Community, Euratom, which was created in 1958. These 3 organizations were founded in the 50s.
Mm-hmm. And the driving force behind them banding together at that time was to secure peace amongst themselves, to avoid another war.
I would say this is probably the most important one, but there were, of course, also economic ideas behind. And of course, in the 50s, we had this very strong East-West confrontation within Europe. And I said before, Western Germany was part of the European Economic Community, while Eastern Germany was not. For sure, there was also the idea of establishing a common market that would also help, of course, these countries to prosper in economic sense.
So now we're in 1958. We have the European Economic Community. We have the European Atomic Energy Community. What happens next?
I think we should jump a few years ahead because the first big admission to the club is in 1973. So in 1973, there are 3 countries that join the European Economic Community, namely Denmark, Ireland, and the UK. So the UK is interesting because we know the UK left actually a few years ago, Brexit, who doesn't know it. But these countries joined on a very different basis.
So they were not looking for peace anymore.
Well, they were maybe also looking for peace, but in the 60s and 70s, the political situation in Europe had, let's say, settled a bit. The initial idea of that another war might break out was probably not as important anymore as maybe the 40s and 50s. Mm-hmm. And so these countries were mainly looking for economic integration. And so these countries, together with other countries, had already founded a few years earlier what is called the European Free Trade Association, EFTA. Still exists today. So this was another club, so to say, not as tightly connected as the EEC, as the European Economic Community, but still like a free trade club. And some of these countries, they wanted to join maybe the more exclusive club. And so they did in the 70s. Maybe an interesting remark is, though, that UK already wanted to join 2 times in the 60s, but a very famous French president, Charles de Gaulle, actually did not allow that. So he vetoed twice the accession application of the UK, and only after he stepped down as president, the UK was finally admitted in the 70s to the European community.
Yeah, tough guy.
Yeah.
And we will see later in the episode that actually any head of state has a lot of power in deciding who joins and even who leaves this club.
Some countries joined because of economic reasons. If we then go to the next round of accession, and this is the round, let's say we bunch 2 rounds together. This is the round in 81 and 86. So in 1981, Greece joins, and in 86, Portugal and Spain joins. So these countries had an interesting history because they were under dictatorships until 1974 for Greece and Portugal, and until 1975 under the dictator of Franco in Spain. And so then they transformed to democracies, and part of their motivation to join the European communities was for sure also economic. These countries were less prosperous than the other countries in the European communities, but it was also an idea to stabilize their political systems, because the countries of the European communities, they were all democracies, quite established by now in the 80s, in the 70s. So 20 or 30 years of stable democratic practice, while these countries just came out of more authoritarian political systems. So it was also an idea to kind of like integrate them in the same political idea. And then jumping again another 10 years ahead, and world politics changed again drastically, because in 1989, 1990, the big change in Europe is, of course, happening with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then also this collapse of the Iron Curtain. And so this big West and East confrontation I mentioned before doesn't exist anymore. And so this also leads to two major rounds of accession. One is the accession in 1995, in which Austria, Finland, and Sweden join. So these are basically other countries of the European Free Trade Agreement. Just to remember, in the 70s, it was Denmark, Ireland, and the UK. Now almost all of the other EFTA countries join.
So this competing club is actually bleeding out.
A bit.
More and more countries are leaving it and joining what in the meantime actually became the European Union in 1983, formally established by the Maastricht Treaty.
Good you mentioned that.
So EU team is winning over EFTA team. Take that.
By the way, also a funny side remark, number 2, is that Norway is, I think, the only country that actually wanted to join twice the European communities. So already in the 70s and now again in the 90s, and twice the Norwegian actually voted against it. So they voted against their plans of their own politicians. But just to close this bracket on Norway. So Norway is not joining in 95, but Austria,
No
Finland...
way.
No way, exactly. But Austria, Finland, and Sweden. And they also, again, more from the idea of economic integration. And also, these countries were actually relatively neutral during the West-Eastern confrontation. And now, since this confrontation doesn't exist anymore, they say, well, not joining the EU. And to wrap things up, in the 2000s, we then see the big, let's call them Eastern accession round. These are 3 rounds, and the biggest one is May 1st, 2004. This is the biggest ever round in which Cyprus, Czechia, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Malta, Poland, Slovakia, and Slovenia joined the EU. 3 years later, or 2.5 years later, January 1st, 2007, Bulgaria and Romania join. And then also July 1st, 2013, Croatia joins.
And this is the last country to join the EU ever since.
Exactly.
Croatia was the last one to enter.
And I also would argue that most of these countries that join, there might be subtle differences between the reasons, but overall these countries were looking forward to join a more Western alliance, and also, of course, hoping for an integration in this economic club, and also to obviously also reap economic benefits. Being integrated in this club of rich countries might also bring economic opportunities.
So what I find very interesting here is that throughout time, countries that have become EU member states, countries that have joined this club, have done so for different reasons. But a unifying thread is that they all see that being part of this bloc of countries brings benefits to them, be it the benefits of a stronger economy, be it political benefits and perhaps domestic stability, or just the promise of peace, or perhaps loftier ideals that we today associate with Western democracies.
And I think what you just said, the different reasons, I think these we can also probably identify when it comes to the current candidates. We have currently 9 candidates who want to join the EU, and I think they also have different reasons why they want to join the EU. Just to name maybe 2 of them, the latest one that kind of like filed for application, Ukraine and Moldova, and Georgia. All of them actually did that in February and March 2022. We all know what happened in February in 2022.
What happened in February 2022, Alex? Please refresh our memory.
Well, a rather big country called Russia invaded its neighbor. So these 3 countries are probably...
Called Ukraine.
Exactly, Ukraine. And these countries are obviously not only, I guess, looking for economic integration, but they also hope, of course, being protected, being in the EU.
So in a way, we're going full circle. So right now, we're also looking for peace and stability.
Yeah, I would argue so. However, other countries that are currently on the list to join the EU, and there's a big block of countries, so-called Western Balkan countries, which are Montenegro, Serbia, Albania, North Macedonia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. These are countries that might not join primarily because they need peace or protection from a big neighbor. They probably look for economic opportunities and maybe also political stability and other reasons. So again, I think also reasons why countries join today, it's still varied.
And we have another country wishing to join since 1987, which, by the way, is the same year where your favorite podcast host was born, called Turkey. And Turkey has been interested in joining the EU for pretty much 4 decades. But its process has not gone according to the original plan, because it's still at that standstill since 2018, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, indeed. It's the negotiations for Turkey's accession started in 2005 in December. Some progress was made, but at some point, no more progress was made. And I think a lot of people actually have forgotten by now that Turkey is still a candidate country. Yeah, so Turkey is indeed a very special case, but this maybe is a good point to talk about how to actually sign up for the exclusive EU club. Vic, what are the conditions for membership? Where can I sign up?
That's an excellent question, Alex. So if you are a country who would like to join the EU, there are a number of basic conditions that you need to meet. The first one is you need to be a European state. Any European state is eligible for EU membership, according to Article 49 of the Treaty on the European Union. But on top of that, you need to respect democratic values, the democratic values of the EU, and you need to commit to promoting them. This includes respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities. So that's the baseline. Now, if you meet those 2 conditions, then there are a number of key criteria for accession. So additional conditions that you need to meet. These are political, economic, and the ability to implement the obligations of membership, which includes basically adhering to political, economic, and the monetary union that the European Union is. When it comes to political criteria, you need to be able to have stable institutions that guarantee democracy and the rule of law, human rights. When it comes to economic criteria, a requirement is that you have a functioning market economy and the capacity to cope with the competition and the market forces of the European Union.
So no Marxist country can join the EU.
Well, you need to be competitive, right? Because you need to be able to withstand the internal market, the free flow of goods, services, and people. Because what the European Union wants to make sure is that whoever joins the club does so in a way that strengthens the club. Mm-hmm. It needs to be a country that is politically, economically stable. And these are the basic conditions that were outlined already years ago, and they are known as the Copenhagen criteria. Now, there are additional conditions for the Western Balkans. We talked how Croatia was the last country to join the EU and how the rest of the Western Balkans today are still waiting or in the process of trying to accede the European Union as a member state. So all these countries have to meet a number of additional conditions that are outlined in what is called the stabilization and association process. And this process is also a way to make sure that they also have the support from the European Union to be able to meet those criteria and then be in a better position to join the club.
So basically, you told me now the list where I need to check my boxes before I can sign up for the exclusive club. But let's say now I'm confident that I could tick the boxes. What's happening after I filed my application, signed it, and handed over to the Belgian post so it arrives in Brussels?
Yeah. So this is what we just talked about is sort of the general eligibility criteria, but then there are very concrete steps. The country, so the central government of that country wishing to join the EU needs to submit an application. And this application is submitted to the Council of the European Union, so to EU member states. That's the body where they meet and chat and decide on important matters. So once the application is submitted, then a different EU body, in this case the European Commission, submits an opinion on this application. So this opinion is very detailed analysis of the country's legal and constitutional framework and how that country's legislation stacks up against the body of EU laws, norms, and regulations. This is what in EU lingo is called the EU acquis. And I'm not even sure I'm pronouncing it correctly because I think this is, thank you, this is the first time that I ever uttered this word. It's basically, just to wrap up, it's basically like a big questionnaire that the Commission sends to the interested country and that it complements with, of course, its own research and its own figures. So,
but we couldn't do an episode on the EU accession without mentioning the EU acquis. I think it's fine. It's good that you mentioned this jargon word here.
Yeah, after dozens of episodes, we finally call it a spade, and we talk about the EU acquis. So
let's hope we pronounce it correctly.
So once the Commission forms its opinion on the application of this country, it submits its opinion to the Council of the European Union. And based on this opinion, the Council can take a political decision as to whether to move forward with this country's application or not. If the country is deemed to not sufficiently meet their requirements, then the European Commission will tell them, well, these are the specific reforms that you need to work on before we can move forward with your application. But in case the Council deems that the country is ready to move forward, then member states must unanimously vote to activate the next step, which is giving this country candidate status. So it is at this stage that the country is officially a candidate to join the European Union. Before it was an applicant, now you've been upgraded to a candidate. And then member states need to also unanimously decide to open accession negotiations, which then are in a way subcontracted to the European Commission. The European Commission is giving a mandate to carry out these accession negotiations. And the first thing that the European Commission does, as the European Commission very well knows how to do, is to put together a negotiation framework. So this will be what will guide the talks, the negotiations, and this negotiation framework needs also to be agreed on by the EU member states. And then the negotiation starts. And the way that these negotiations are structured is around clusters and chapters. And there is basically 6 clusters, each of which contains several chapters, up to a total of 35 chapters. And these clusters are thematic clusters. So they cover the fundamentals of the EU, the internal market, competitiveness and inclusive growth, green agenda, sustainable connectivity, resources, agriculture and cohesion, and external relations. So these chapters are opened and closed, and once all the chapters are closed, then negotiations can be considered to be finalized. But to close chapters, every single EU government needs to agree that the chapter can be closed. So this is a process that can extend for not only months, but actually several years. As we mentioned before, there are countries that have been waiting for decades, namely Turkey, to close chapters. And it is an open question as to whether that country or other countries will be able to close them all.
So in every step, so first, for moving from application to candidate status, all the European countries need to agree, and then all the countries need to agree to open the negotiations. And then for closing every of the single chapters, we need all the time an anonymous vote of all European countries.
That's right.
So do I understand correctly that these are a bit like homeworks the candidate country need to do? So you talked before about the EU acquis, which is basically a jargon word for everything that the European Union has produced in terms of like legislative stuff. Mostly laws, but also norms and all kinds of other regulations in all fields. And basically the candidate countries, since they join the EU, they need then to adapt all their laws at home to that body. Is that kind of like what's happening? And the EU is checking in these chapters.
Yes, so the European Commission is monitoring the compliance of this country with the EU acquis, with this body of laws and regulations. And it could be, I imagine in some cases, a candidate country already complies with a number of obligations, and then there is less homework for that country to do. But there are other countries that are less compliant, and then they have additional homework. So this homework is, of course, in the form of their own internal reforms. So passing also legislation that is aligned with EU legislation, making sure that they meet the conditions that will allow them to be a responsible member state once they join the European Union. They need to be ready. There is no blank check that is handed out. So that's the purpose of these negotiations. But even when the negotiations close, Alex, that still doesn't make the candidate country a member state. Because when the negotiations are closed, then the European Commission issues an opinion that, again, you will guess correctly, is sent to the Council of the European Union for member states to vote on closing formally the accession negotiations. And at this stage, also, the European Parliament must give its consent. So then this other EU body gets into play. And once the accession negotiations have been formally closed, then it's time for EU member states and the candidate country to sign and then ratify an accession treaty. And this is a point where the candidate country cements its membership in the European Union. This is when it's carved into stone, and we'll see why this is the case, because it's not so easy then to leave. And it is in this accession treaty that it is detailed that basically the terms and conditions of the membership, any transitional or financial arrangements that the country still needs to carry out, the deadlines, the financial contributions that the country will make to the European Union, to the budget of the Union, also how much it will receive back from that budget. So all those details are in the accession treaty. And as I mentioned before, this treaty needs to be ratified. And once it's ratified, then it will enter into force on a specific date that is also indicated in the treaty. So between the moment that the treaty is drafted and signed and the moment that it's ratified by every single EU member state, this candidate country is known as an acceding country. So it's still not an EU member state. And during that period of time, it benefits from some special arrangements. So, for instance, it's consulted and can comment on draft EU proposals and can be an observer in EU bodies and agencies, but it cannot vote. So it's a silent observer in a way. So it can make recommendations and suggestions that may or may not be taken into account by the rest of the EU member states, because this country is not yet an EU member state. Eventually, when everybody ratifies the treaty and the treaty enters into force, then that acceding country, formerly a candidate and formerly an applicant, finally becomes a member state of the European Union.
Wow. So this was a long process. Well explained, Vic. Sounds for me a bit like going to a very important and hard to see emperor, and you have to wait in like 50 rooms before, and you have to talk to a lot of people and convince a lot of people that you are actually worth visiting and seeing this very, very famous celebrity somewhere.
That's right, Alex. And you know what? I believe that the process also of becoming an EU member state has become harder over time. So it's become more complex, because an important caveat is that these 35 chapters that we mentioned before are constantly evolving. So the conditions of EU membership evolve over time. So I think it's fair to say that today there are more conditions, there are more rules, and there are also more points where EU member states, the current EU member states, can veto a candidate's accession to the EU. I think it's no wonder that since 2013 we haven't had any new EU member states.
And this makes also total sense, because the EU has today way more competencies than 30 years ago. So the EU acquis, the jargon word we have been using now too often, but it's still what it is. It has, of course, been growing like a lot. If I'm just like reflecting on how many also big laws have been implemented in the last year at the European level, of course, this is a lot of extra pages that countries have to understand and also implement into their national laws. So this will be much harder to join the EU now. With a more powerful EU to join now is, of course, harder than a way less integrated European Union in the 70s or 80s.
That's right.
You know?
It's like buying stocks, you know? If you buy when a company is nascent, when it's a little chicken, you know, maybe even about to hatch, then the stock is likely to be low. But then if you want to buy the stock of companies that are already fully developed, have proven to be successful and a good investment, then that stock is going to be a lot more expensive.
How long can this process take, Vic? This sounds complicated and very cumbersome.
Alex, it takes as long as it must. There are no deadlines. As we mentioned before, there is Turkey. They submitted their application to join the EU in 1987, and they've been waiting ever since. So you need to close all the chapters. There is no workaround. So the speed of the negotiation really depends on the speed of the reforms and the alignment with EU laws in each candidate country. And that can vary a lot.
Vic, you said before that countries need to decide unanimously in the application process. So is it then the European countries that are in the end the bouncer, so to say, to this club that decide who gets in and who doesn't?
Yeah, that's correct. It's essentially EU member states who are in the driving seats. They are the members of the Council of the European Union, which is an institution that initially receives the membership application and then decides on whether to move forward at each step. And as you mentioned, all countries must agree unanimously. So there are a number of opportunities for individual countries to block the accession process. And you can also argue that as the EU has expanded from 6 to 27 member states today, there are more opportunities or more countries that can block the accession negotiations. So if you've ever tried settling an argument between a group of friends, you probably understand very well that the fewer people arguing, the easier it is to come to an understanding. The more people you bring to the deciding table, the harder it is to make everyone happy. So yeah, it's essentially member states, but I have to say that the European Commission also plays an important role. The European Commission doesn't make these final decisions, but the European Commission does prepare opinions, assesses the progress that countries are making, which is also published in the form of enlargement reports every year. They also provide support to candidate countries. And at some stage, the European Parliament must also give its consent. There are several actors, but the ones in the driving seat are EU member states.
And just to add a little detail on how powerful the member states are and how a single member state can also block the accession process, I think it is helpful to mention the case of North Macedonia, which, by the way, applied in 2004. So this is actually the country after Turkey that it has been waiting the longest. And the negotiations haven't even started yet. Also interesting. And one reason, I don't say it's the only reason, but one reason is also the neighboring country Greece, which was not happy actually about how the country North Macedonia was actually called. The country renamed itself to North Macedonia, and so by that pleasing the Greek government, and so the Greek government would not longer block the accession process.
It's funny you mentioned that because we did an episode back in the days on this name conflict between the Republic of North Macedonia and Greece. So worth going back in time and listening to that one. I think is very topical.
Actually, the second episode of EU Untangled. What's in a name?
What's in a name? The power of names.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So now we're happy. The new country has joined the European Union.
You're an EU member state.
Yay!
Welcome.
Everybody's happy, big
Hooray!
fireworks and all that,
Dancing, drinking on the streets.
Okay, but then you wake up on the 1st of January
with a headache.
With a headache, exactly. And you wake up and then there's somebody actually knocking at the door and says, well, but sorry, you have to still follow the rules. What are the rules and obligations for the country that just joined the European Union?
Yeah. So we talked before about the benefits of joining, right? Everlasting peace, economic benefits, political stability. But it's true that joining the EU also comes with obligations. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but all EU member states commit to transposing and complying with EU law, transposing it into national law. Of course, for candidate countries, they will have already aligned with the EU acquis during the negotiation process, but new EU law comes into place every year. And this is a commitment to implementing these laws and having them reflected in their domestic laws as well. They need to continuously uphold EU values, which we mentioned before. They also need to make monetary contributions to the budget of the European Union. In theory, you also commit to adopting the EU's common currency, also known as the euro, and you also have to take part in the governance of the EU. So member states take turns every 6 months to chair the rotating presidency of the European Union. This is actually the Council of the EU that we're talking about. They also can and must elect representatives to the European Parliament, and they also have an EU commissioner appointed with every college of commissioners every 7 years. So they have a representative in all the EU institutions, so they effectively start taking part into all the EU decision-making process.
You outlined how to join the club. Then you also said, okay, what are the rules when you're in the club? Well, my question, of course, is there an exit door?
You mean, what if you want to leave the club?
Yeah. Is there a door to leave it?
Yes. So the door swings both ways. So there is a specific provision in the Treaty of the European Union that allows any member states to withdraw from the Union, as long as they meet their own internal national constitutional requirements. And the clearest example of this is the United Kingdom, that decided in a referendum in 2016 to leave the European Union and formally triggered this exit process that came to be known as Brexit in March 2017 and dragged on for almost 3 years until it finally ended in January 2020. In some ways, it's similar to the accession process because the member state that wishes to leave needs to notify the council of its intention to leave. And then there is a process of, again, negotiation to conclude an agreement with that state and setting out the arrangements for its withdrawal from the Union. And then all of this is formalized in a withdrawal agreement that must be concluded by the Council by qualified majority after getting the consent of the European Parliament. So again, it's a cumbersome procedure. It's not so easy to just leave and say, bye, Felicias.
Yeah.
I don't want to party with you anymore. So farewell. No, there is also a process and it takes time. It costs a pretty penny and the benefits of leaving are not clear.
So you can leave, but what about a country that does not maybe uphold anymore the values of the European Union and all the other countries believe this country should not be part anymore of the club? What do we do?
That sounds like an unruly kid.
You know, some member of a club, of a fitness club that is demolishing the nice equipment.
Yeah, you mean monopolizing the pressing bench all the time while texting and then not wearing flip-flops in the shower.
Yeah, kind of like in this direction.
Bothering other users of the gym.
Yeah,
not cleaning after themselves.
Yeah.
Ugh, so annoying. Yeah, so, okay, actually, what you're asking is, can an EU member state be kicked out of the European Union? So they don't want to leave. They're not the UK. They very much want to stay, but they don't behave. What can other EU member states do? Well, if that is your question, Alex, I'm afraid I have a very sobering answer because the short answer is a member cannot lose their membership. So a member of the European Union cannot be kicked out. It is not foreseen in the treaties because the treaties were built in a way that would make it very difficult or almost impossible for anyone to be kicked out because the point was to coexist in peace. So this option was not taken on board and therefore you cannot kick somebody out. But you have some options to try to bring that unruly member state back in line. And one of the options that has been talked about in media in the past years is what some media outlets call the nuclear option, which is activating a specific article in the Treaty of the European Union called Article 7, which takes away certain rights from that member state, specifically could be voting rights. So again, a way to take away power from that member state. And this has been proposed in the past to address the behavior of Hungary and Poland, which are countries that have passed reforms that go against the independence of the judiciary, the freedom of media and civil society, and the rights of migrants, women, and minorities. This is an article that hasn't been triggered. I don't think it's ever been triggered because it's also difficult to do that. It requires a proposal by a third of the member states of the European Union or by the European Commission. It requires the consent of the European Parliament, and then the European Council needs to approve this unanimously. This is an article that has never been used, and there are other ways in which you can try to bring back order to the club. In 2021, the rule of law conditionality mechanism was introduced. This is just a fancy name for a tool that can be used when there is a breach of the rule of law in an EU member state that could affect the financial interests of the Union. And then by activating this mechanism, the European Union can suspend payments to a member state. We talked before about the EU budget. So payments that member state is due can be suspended. So that's a very big incentive for that member state to comply with the rule of law and to get back their money.
And maybe just to add, for completeness, there is a theoretical option to kick a member state out by creating an European Union 2.0, which would constitute of all countries except that one country. Probably this option would only be used in an extremely severe case, maybe of an internal conflict or something. I don't know. I don't even want to speculate about that. You could, of course, do that. Create a new European Union, and then the old country, the one country you want to kick out, is just left alone in this old European Union. But it's more theory, I guess.
Yeah, it's about starting from scratch. You create the club again, and you lay out new conditions.
So you could probably do a lot of copy and paste, but you will still, of course, need a lot of processes. So all the 26 countries would at the same time have to leave the union and refound another union. So it's very difficult, and it's probably more theoretical than actually.
Yeah, it doesn't sound easy at all. I mean, you would probably need to come up with a new flag, a new anthem,
This is probably the
a new
easiest.
name, new slogans, new acronyms for all the acronyms that took so long to be a thing. This would be insane. I understand why it would never work.
It probably would not, but it is just a discussion that was actually mentioned by the former Prime Minister of Netherlands, I think a few years ago, in the negotiations of the last big budget of the European Union. He said something kind of like in a side sentence with journalists, and he said something like, in case, we can refound the European Union without these two. He said this, but then he later also stepped back and said, look, he didn't mean it like this.
Just kidding.
Yeah, just kidding. But I think he said it, he dropped it, kind of like to say, look, we could do that if really things go really bad as a political tool rather than actually meaning it.
Yeah.
That's why I wanted to mention it, not because it is a crazy lawyer that came up with this idea, but it was actually mentioned by a head of state a few years ago, but it's not something that will probably ever happen.
It's a thought experiment, but
exactly.
Since we're talking about, possible scenarios and what could happen, I'd like to try to look ahead, peer into the future, and then ask you, Alex, what do you think is going to happen next? Like, we have 9 countries in the pipeline that want to access the EU. They want to become member states. Like, without naming names, just thinking in pure, let's say, structural terms or geopolitical terms, do you actually see the EU growing further? Like expanding from the current 27 member states, or actually getting smaller? I mean, how big is too big and how small is too small? Like, what is the right balance? Because I feel that today we live in a European Union that is more complex. I think that we see also this drive coming from within the EU institutions also to simplify, to streamline, and there is a growing call from member states to reduce the number of laws and regulations that are created at European level. So in this environment, what is your take?
You asked many questions at once, but I think you had in the beginning you asked, will the European Union grow or shrink, or will it stay the same? And what could happen here? This is a good question, and obviously I don't have the answer, and I think honestly nobody has the answer.
You don't have the answer, Alex?
Nope, sorry. I think
what are you doing here?
I lost my glass ball, so...
Okay, give me your best guesstimate.
Jokes aside, I think what is important is to, what you said before, to think about this structurally. I think the European Union at the moment sits between two chairs, because on the one side, there is a clear interest from the European Union to admit new countries to the Union because of economic reasons that we said before, but also because of geopolitical reasons. And especially, I think the countries of the Western Balkans, to name a few, but also Ukraine and Moldova, obviously there is interest to have these countries integrated within the European Union for increasing influence on the geopolitical level. On the other hand, you said it before, the European Union has become very complex, not only in terms of laws, but also in terms of just how many members need to agree. 27 at the moment. If you admit, of course, more countries, there will be even more voices. So it will be harder to make policy. That's why there was also, in recent years, always this discussion within the European Union. Namely, I think France especially said, before we admit new countries, we need to have a deep European reform where we reform our decision-making so it becomes easier and more effective.
Mm-hmm.
In other countries, for instance, Germany always said, no, we need to be very careful that we are not losing, quote unquote, the Canada countries, because it's important from a geopolitical perspective to integrate them and keep them close to the European Union or even have them as member states. And so I think these two tensions, there exist. And there's, I think, no easy way out at the moment. One way out is, of course, that you are not admitting these countries to the European Union directly, but you form other political groups. There's, for instance, this so-called European political community, which is a wider, very loose group of countries. You could also think about maybe integrating these countries in the European Economic Area and not in the European Union, which is, again, a group of countries that shares a lot the benefits of the European Union when it comes to economic terms, but doesn't have any vote. Okay.
But just to say, the European Economic Area is separate from the European Union.
Absolutely.
So it wouldn't be up to the European Union to use that organization to offer to newcomers.
Absolutely. And of course, another option is to reform the European Union and to either make decision-making easier within the European Union and then admit new countries, or to create something like a two-speed Europe, where you have a core Europe that somehow goes faster, and then you have a Europe which goes slower, quote unquote, when it comes to integration, okay? And so this is also a possibility. I'm just naming a few things here. I'm not saying this will happen or this will not happen.
Well, I think what a lot of these ideas that you mentioned are pointing to is rebuild the kitchen, rethink the menu before you admit more cooks. But then there are also other voices that say, you actually need more hands. Your influence in the world as the European Union, as a bloc of countries, is diminishing, and we can only be stronger together. And the more of us, the more weight we will have on the international stage. And we don't want to lose all these countries that have been waiting for years. We don't want to get them disappointed and then running away and maybe joining a different bloc of nations.
Especially if they're close in geographic terms.
That's right. So it's a real pickle.
I see at the moment very little appetite of European countries to do a big reform of the European Union itself. That would mean a so-called treaty change, so like a change of the entire, let's say, operating system of the European Union, where we really redo the kitchen, what you said before. But on the other hand, I also see the urge of Europe to stay relevant. And so...
one of my favorite mantras comes from one of the founding architects of the EU. And I think I say this in every episode, but Europe will be forged in crisis. Mm-hmm. And I think this applies also to EU enlargement. I think where we stand today is a moment where probably will be shaped by crisis. So the moment a crisis hits, then that will be the incentive to perhaps admit a new member state. And we kind of see that with the very fast process that Moldova and Ukraine have followed in the past 3 years. So I suspect that whoever said this famous sentence, Jean Monnet, by the way, was onto something. And perhaps the future will prove him right yet again.
I couldn't have said it better. That was our conversation on EU enlargement.
If you enjoyed the episode, please consider leaving a rating or review on your favorite podcast platform. It helps other people discover the show.
And you can, of course, follow EU Untangled on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Blue Sky to stay updated on future episodes and behind-the-scenes content.
We'd love to hear from you, whether it's feedback on this episode, ideas for future topics, or just a hello. Just go ahead and send us an email at mail@untangled-podcast.eu.
That's mail@untangled-podcast.eu, just in case you forgot it already.
Just in case you didn't understand, Victor? Wow, Alex, that's pretty low, even for you.
Okay, well, anyway, before we start here fighting on the show, thanks for listening and see you next time.
Bye, Felicia.
Bye-bye.
I'm Brexiting here.